I live in the city.
I see. Well, I thought that was like a symbolic sound of the library.
No. All right, I am going to open up the doors and we will be live, and we'll give it a few moments to fill in. And the doors are open. Welcome. Hello, hello. We'll get started in a moment as we let folks come in. I have placed in the chat links to tonight's library news and tonight's author, and links to our partner at Heyday Books. And as Jean speaks and other resources come up, I'll try to keep up and add those to the document. And if you know what native land you're joining us from, you could let us know. And if you don't, you can use that handy map that I just put in the chat box. How's everyone tonight? There will be time. Just saw a hand go up and down super quick. We will have time for questions, Q&As. Try to put your questions in the Q&A function, and I will get those to Jean. And or you can use the chat. I think it's going to be not a huge group, but a nice sized, intimate group. So Q&A, use the Q&A function, and feel free to chat. It's the river of consciousness in Zoom land. All right, the clock has struck. It is 7 o'clock. Welcome. Thank you for joining us on a rainy Tuesday night in our beautiful Bay Area, San Francisco, Ohlone territory. And I want to thank Jean Slater, and I want to thank Heyday Books for joining us. It's a month of Heyday Books for us, and we've had some amazing authors, and we have more to come. The San Francisco Public Library acknowledges that we occupy the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone tribal people, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. We recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. As uninvited guests, we affirm their sovereign rights and First Peoples, and wish to pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community. And that link that I put in the chat box for library events and links has a great reading resource list to mostly Bay Area resources, but some nationwide on First Peoples culture and land rights. Tomorrow night, 7 p.m., same time, same place in Zoomland, we have a performance. This is going to be a good one. And it's a one-time only. There's no recording of this event, so please come on out. And it's a partnership with the Museum of African Diaspora. And we have Kevin Simmons and Poet Laureate, past Poet Laureate, Deborah Major, and James Cagney, and Valletta Brinson. And they are going to be reading and singing, and it's going to be something amazing to see. So I hope you can make it tomorrow evening, 7 p.m. November 16th, live in person at the main library at the Soroyan Gallery. And that's located on the beautiful 6th floor. I know a lot of people don't make it all the way up there, but it's worth it. Plus, there's an amazing poster show up there right now by SF Poster Syndicate, which is an amazing group, and they have some great prints. So come check out the art, come check out the book. And Grave Matters is about the controversy over excavating California's indigenous peoples. Another Heyday book. And Tony Platt will be in conversation with Milton Reynolds at this event. This event is also streaming, so if you can't make it in person or you're not yet comfortable making it in person, we get you. So we have you covered. The very next day in our beautiful Corrette Auditorium, we had an event there this weekend. Not a whole lot of people showed up, but it was, I missed the space. It's just such a lovely theater, and we hope to get it used again. So come on down, plenty of space to spread out. And again, we will be streaming this as well. So We understand it's a weird time. And then I just want to quickly highlight some events we have in December. My friend Justin DeMong, who is the one of the co-directors at the Before Columbus Foundation, will be discussing free jazz and Black Power with Louis R. Gordon. Looking forward to that. Let's see, we have a film screening in honor of Jack Hirschman, the story of Jack Hirschman. We have a panel of amazing humans talking about Dodie Bellamy's The Letter of Mina Harker, which is being re-released this year. And then this is one I'm totally looking forward to. Meet us at the bar. We're having a book group at the bar. So Mallory O'Mara will be in person discussing her new book, Girly Drinks, A World History of Women and Alcohol. And it is at the beautiful Champagne Room, which is part of the Oasis on 11th Street, 7 p.m., December 14th, one free drink ticket. Come buy the book. Let's enjoy a little time together, have a drink, and spend the night together a little bit. All right, without further ado, I'm going to introduce tonight's speaker. And again, I want to thank Heyday Books for being, just so amazing in Bay Area and bringing all these amazing authors and being such great partners to us at SFPL. Jean's book, Freedom to Discriminate, uncovers realtors' definitive role in segregating America and shaping modern conservative ideology. Drawing on confidential documents from leaders of the real estate industry, Slater reveals how realtors systematically created and justified residential segregation. Jean Slater has served as a senior advisor on housing for federal, state, and local agencies for over 40 years. He co-founded and chairs CSG Advisors, which has been one of the nation's leading advisors on affordable housing for decades. His projects have received numerous national awards, and in the aftermath of the financial crisis in 2009, he helped design the program by which the United States Treasury financed homes for 110,000 first-time home buyers. He holds a degree from Columbia, MIT, and Stanford. He was born and raised in Brooklyn, but now he's a Bay Area person. So without further ado, Mr. Gene Slater.
Thank you very much. How did America become a place where every city is racially divided in almost identical ways, and where a conservative vision of freedom as your absolute personal rights to limit the rights of others has shifted the country to the right for more than 50 years? These are two defining features of modern America. And the history I'm going to show shows how deeply they are connected, but both were inventions of the nation's organized real estate industry, the Realtors, to sell homes by permanently dividing Americans. So I'll present this as a series of like 4 questions that I'll try and answer to frame this. One was, how was segregation invented? Then what role did the Bay Area and California particularly play why did they play such a central national role in segregation? Then how did the politics of perpetuating segregation, particularly in California, but how did those politics, the effort that shape our modern ideological divides today, our modern politics? And then last, how does segregation remain so powerful today, more than 50 years after fair housing was finally passed? So let me start with how segregation was invented. So the myth that got promoted by the Realtors, and by the Realtors, I should say, we now think of them as, individuals selling homes. But the Realtors, who were created in the early 1900s as local real estate boards and then trademarked the name Realtors, became very quickly in the early 1900s, became an enormously powerful cartel, who, even though there were like 3 or 4% of the brokers in the country or in any given area, came to dominate 80% of home sales through the multiple listing service they created that allowed them to double commissions and make those stick. These were all white real estate boards, very socially exclusive. And they became and were known, viewed by Congress as the most powerful lobbyists in the country by mid-century. They created the Appraisal Institute, what's now the National Institute of Home Builders, property management, apartment management. All these were sort of their functions, and their associate members were the banks and the title companies and everybody else involved in the real estate industry. And many of the leading realtors became the country's leading developers. So that's who the realtors were. So one of the myths that they used after they had created segregation was that it was natural, normal, historical. It had always been this way. So we have a myth that got accepted by both blacks and whites. It's sort of like, well, it must have always been like this. But if you go back to the early 1900s, you find that American cities were not racially divided. People lived by where they could afford rather than by their ancestry. Sort of one of my aha moments in doing this research was a quote from J.B. Loving, who was a Black real estate broker in Los Angeles in 1904, who said, the Negroes of the city have proudly refused to segregate themselves, but live in many of the best neighborhoods with the best homes and the best infrastructure. And that was true not only in Los Angeles, then the fastest growing city in the country, but it was true throughout the country. It was true in in border cities like Louisville, Washington, St. Louis, where there were hundreds of racially mixed blocks. So segregation was something new. It was an invention, like the airplane was invented, and about the same time as the airplane. And realtors would lend, and the power to do it, it took to create segregation, you had to racially divide the country's historically rambunctious free real estate market. So it took the power of this realtor cartel, their code of ethics that would throw out anybody who sold a home to a minority, their ability to basically destroy the business of anybody in real estate who didn't subscribe to the approach that they did. It took that effort to organize the country's free markets and to racially separate them. And it's an effort that transformed America's courts, America's suburbs, our local governments. And that you'll see as a theme through this, that what it took to create segregation really changed the country fundamentally for everybody. Not only those whose lives it's so damaged by permanently excluding them, but for all Americans. So I quoted that Black real estate agent in Los Angeles in 1904 about not segregating themselves and living in many areas. By 1917, another Black in Los Angeles resident said, the whites have encircled us with invisible walls, and they've made it impossible to move beyond those walls. And the Los Angeles Housing Commission, now one of our clients, back in the early 1910s said it would be possible for Mexican Americans to find lots of places to live in Los Angeles if only every, new subdivision wasn't racially restricted. So what I want to turn to, so this was a myth that segregation was natural and historic. Similarly, it was a myth of birds of a feather flock together. Even in immigrant neighborhoods where people, came and were in the same neighborhood speaking the same language, these were always mixed and never one ethnic group dominated, and people moved out, all ethnic groups moved out as quickly as they could to find better housing. That was what segregation prevented when it came to those who it excluded. Nor was segregation a matter of not being able to afford homes. In fact, the consequence of segregation, like any restricted market, is it pushed up the prices that African Americans had to pay by 20 or 30% more than in similar, for the same condition, housing elsewhere. Nor was segregation simply the result of racism. Obviously, racism, drove segregation, but racism was just as strong, if not stronger, in 1900 than it was in 1920 or 1950 or in the center of the story I'm going to tell in the 1960s. It took organized power of the real estate industry to transform the free markets. So it's important to recognize it as something new in America, something that hadn't existed and had to be created. And I'll tell this story. So my second question is, how did the Bay Area and California play such a central role in the creation and the maintenance of segregation? So if you want to find the first segregated, racially restricted neighborhood in the United States, go to Berkeley, a mile from the campus, to an area near the Claremont Hotel, where a subdivision was created in 1905 by Duncan McDuffie, who was the leader of the firm that's now still is Mason McDuffie, whose signs you'll see at open houses all over the Bay Area. McDuffie was an ardent environmentalist. He later became, for many years, the national president of the Sierra Club and helped create the Save the Redwoods League and California's park system. McDuffie had a vision of creating subdivisions not in the way that they were usually created at the time, which is just you lay out paper streets and market homes. But he had a vision of creating environmentally beautiful subdivisions. And you can see in Claremont, he later did St. Francis Wood and many subdivisions, high-end subdivision of the Bay Area, to create the highest end subdivisions with landscape planning by the likes of the Olmsted brothers, with topographic streets and preserving the trees. And part of doing that, this was a real estate finance problem he was solving. Part of doing that was, if you build such a large subdivision with expensive costs and infrastructure, you have to know what's going to happen to that property over the 5 or 7 years it's going to take to sell those lots. Remember, subdividers at the time, they simply divided lots. They weren't home builders. Homes got built individually or by small contractors back in the early 1900s. So to create this subdivision, he used a new idea that had just been used to development outside Baltimore of covenants, restrictive covenants that would impose on each owner of a lot and say, there's certain things you can't do here. You have to build a house of at least a certain size or at least a certain price, because you wanted this to remain a high-end area. You can't have commercial development. You can't build an apartment house. You can't have a brothel. You can't have bars. And to these, he added one more covenant that hadn't been used in America at this time, partly because they didn't know the courts would uphold it. He created a covenant that said, for the next 30 years and perpetuating thereafter, no non-Caucasian can ever live here except as a servant. And in selling this idea of covenants, this was the restrictions on owners. McDuffie was first having to convince, through his salesman, buyers who would say, no, it's not un-American to limit what I can do with my property. And they said, no, it's not the restrictions on you which matter. It's the restrictions on your neighbors which count. To help enforce these covenants, McDuffie, and at the same time, a developer, J.C. Nichols in Kansas City, created the first homeowners associations in America. So you want to know where homeowners associations they came from? They came to enforce these covenants. And if you ask, why was McDuffie imposing these racial covenants for this very high-end development? The most expensive house lots in the Bay Area at a time when the minority population of Bay Area was very small. It was hardly likely the first Japanese immigrants could buy homes there, or African Americans. This was really a form of social cachet, and saying your children are always going to play with children like them. He called this planning for permanence. And this approach, these restrictive covenants, and these racial covenants proved so popular that they, within a year or two, started being used in high-end developments throughout California, Beverly Hills, LA, Los Angeles, other parts of the Bay Area. McDuffie used these to build homes, restricted homes for 100,000 Bay Area residents. And so much was this seen as like part of the social establishment. He was a progressive in the spirit of Teddy Roosevelt. His partner, C.C. Young, became Speaker of the State Assembly and later, Governor of California. McDuffie was appointed all these positions to reinforce. But racial covenants originally were intended as a way to limit what could happen on one's own property. But realtors in existing neighborhoods said, this is a great technique for selling homes here too, and for increasing their value and assuring customers of what will happen around them. So they began basically hiring people who went door to door with petitions, which you would sign, putting a covenant on your own home that would go into effect when 75% of the people bought such homes. And this covenant plan, perfected in Pasadena, became widely used in Berkeley and in Oakland, spread across the country. So you now had both new developments and you had existing homes covered by the same approach. And California became the epicenter for the creation of these racial covenants that quickly spread across the country. In the 1930s, when FHA was created by the federal government, one of the, in many ways, most brilliant and most powerful housing inventions in the history of the world, created the low down payment mortgage, fixed rate, fully amortized, and you couldn't get at the time. It made the cost of buying a home no higher than it was to rent for many people. Created all the vast new subdivisions of the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s. It was the realtors who were the prime lobbyists for this, the shapers of it. Their chief underwriter became the first chief underwriter of FHA. Their most active field office was in Los Angeles, where it was headed by a former key realtor in Los Angeles. And it was the realtors in each city who did the first drafts of what became the redlining maps. Now, everybody talks about redlining maps now. At the time, they were actually secret. The NACP, vast efforts, finally found some of the racist language in the underwriting manuals. But these redlining maps, weren't visible or available, for 30 or 40 years. In 1940, I'm just giving a quick history of this through the lens of California, because it's important to understand what happened here. Finally, in 1948, the Supreme Court ruled in Shelley versus Kramer that courts couldn't enforce racial covenants. And the realtors in California sort of apocalyptically reacted by proposing a US constitutional amendment that would overturn the 14th Amendment and would create apartheid in America illegally. This was, zoning hadn't allowed, couldn't be used racially because that was government control. And so zoning had become an adjunct to racial covenants. It was Duncan McDuffie in Berkeley, chairman of the Berkeley Planning Board in 1916, created the first single family zoning in America. Why? Because he wanted to prevent a Negro dance hall from being built in Elmwood, a little ways away from his own subdivision. So zoning was created by the realtors. It was they who created zoning and anyway, city planning in the country as an adjunct, as a support for, but not directly doing covenants. So back in 1948, they proposed this constitutional amendment, same year as apartheid in South Africa. But on the advice of their lawyers, they said there are quieter ways you can do this. You can keep putting covenants on, you just can't enforce them. And so if you look at Westlake and Daly City, the largest homeowners association in California, that was done that way. They used racial steering. So powerful was the racial steering mechanism and the code of ethics of the realtors and their control. They never allowed, by the 1960s, there wasn't a single African American among the 40,000 realtors in California or 80,000 nationally. So powerful was this that here in the 1950s, in the Bay Area, then is now one of the more liberal parts of the country, out of 325,000 new single family homes, 50 were sold without regard to race. In the Palo Alto area, 600 brokers who were surveyed, only 3 would even consider showing a home minority area, showing home in a white area to a minority. So that's how powerful segregation was. And now California, in many ways, because it had half the realtors in the country and so much of the real estate industry, served as a national model for this. So let me turn, now I'm going to turn the page both in time but also in terms of the consequences for our American politics today. I want to talk about how the effort to perpetuate segregation, to defeat the civil rights movement, to prevent fair housing, how that shapes our ideological divides and created the conservative vision of freedom that's come to dominate much of American politics, and that we see on issue after issue, from guns to abortion to campaign contributions to dealing with climate change to vaccines. Much of this came in 1963 and 1964, when the Realtors faced a fair housing law in California, first law with some teeth, an administrative enforcement mechanism called the Rumford Act. In some states, in a few states, in Colorado and Massachusetts, the Realtors had decided to go along with such laws and try and make them work. But the California Real Estate Association, headed up by their new president, Spike Wilson, who had been a news editor in Sacramento, headed the Fresno Realty Board, has been president of local Kiwanis. He decided to take this up as a challenge and not merely try and overturn the law or get it amended, but to put a state constitutional amendment on the ballot. Remember, they had thought in 1948 of a US constitutional amendment to defend segregation. So here was the idea of a state constitutional amendment. They would go to the voters, they would collect 1 million signatures. And this ballot initiative, called Proposition 14, a 1964 ballot, said neither the state nor any subdivision or any political subdivision, neither any city or county, can ever limit the absolute discretion of an owner to sell or rent property to who he or she wants to, and to use a broker to do it. This proposition created a problem from the Realtors' point of view. This is the height of the civil rights movement, it's the height of support for American liberalism. It's the year that passed the federal civil rights law that most Californians supported. Lyndon Johnson's about to go on to crush Barry Goldwater in the 1964 election, but roughly 60% of the vote. The Realtors were entirely isolated in making this argument. Not even the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce, their long ally, would support them. No business group would support them. Labor unions were against them. The Catholic Church and all the archbishops, almost all church leaders, civic groups. No conservative politician, not Barry Goldwater, who would oppose the Federal Civil Rights Act, nor Ronald Reagan at the time, would endorse the Realtors for fear of being seen as racist. So how were the Realtors going to wage this campaign? And the answer was to take on directly the argument for freedom that had propelled the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King at the March on Washington had used freedom 20 times, and equality once in his speech. And he talked about freedom, quoting the Gettysburg Address and going back to the Declaration of Independence, that freedom meant the shared freedom of all Americans, a freedom that had been denied in many ways, but this was reclaiming that freedom. It meant, as said in the Declaration of Independence, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Government is created to secure these rights, that was the role of government. What Spike Wilson, this realtor and brilliant propagandist, did was he created an opposite idea of freedom. He began by writing a full-page newspaper ad called the Property Owner's Bill of Rights that he claimed and was put in newspapers throughout California and nationally. And it had a picture of a patriot from 1776 with one of those tricorner hats or Liberty Bell, so the Realtors were the new Paul Revere. And it laid out and said, these are the rights of property owners for which the revolution was fought. This is why America was created. To make this idea palatable, the Realtors had to do a couple of things, and these had powerful influences on American politics. There's the things they had to solve for in winning a campaign, appealing to the vast majority of voters in 1964, in a liberal moderate state with Pat Brown, liberal two-term governor who had defeated Richard Nixon for re-election, making fair housing his highest priority. So what the Realtors did was they became the first language of colorblind freedom. They said, we're in favor of the same rights for everybody. The rights of all owners, the right to discriminate. There was the property owners. We are defending those rights. Am I anti-Negro? Spike Wilson asked at a meeting of the Apartment Owners Association in Los Angeles. By God, I am not. I am their greatest champion. They said, we are the defenders of equal rights, unlike the civil rights movement who only care about the interests of special groups. Because here was the key. They took a single narrow right, a right nobody had ever talked about in 200 years, the right of an owner to say, well, I don't want the highest price for my home. I want to control the race of who I sell it to, a right that realtors themselves had violated with racial covenants for 50 years. They made this right, they took this right and elevated it as a single absolute right. And they said, this is the litmus test of American freedom. If government takes away this right, it's taking away your freedom. This is a last chance to defend American freedom. So what they were doing was they were defining freedom as a zero sum. Instead of Martin Luther King's idea of shared freedom that requires government balancing those rights, like freedom of speech and freedom of press, it always had to be balanced. Instead of that notion, it said, no, freedom belongs to you personally. It's your individual property, just like private property, in fact, with the analog of your own home. This is your freedom. And what government is doing is taking away that freedom to give special rights to others. Because freedom is these traditional rights, but the right not to be discriminated against, the right to buy a home in the first place, that was some special privilege, not rights. We hear this language now, with all the voting rights laws that being passed around, the restrictions on voting rights around the country. Surveys show, 80% of Republicans now view voting not as a fundamental right, but as a privilege to be limited to those, who deserve it. That was the rhetoric of the realtors. So they only talked about this one narrow right. And you can see this same idea, taking a single narrow right, calling it freedom itself, could and then would be used on issue after issue. It would be used on abortion, it would be used on guns. And in fact, part of the power, what's made conservatives successful, was not having an adventitious alliance of groups concerned about all these disparate causes, but using the same rhetoric of individual freedom, the heart of this. A key to this was calling, what the realtors did is they said, discrimination is a matter of, to discriminate is to choose. Discrimination is a matter of individual conscience and the dictates of your conscience. So they likened it to freedom of religion. What racial discrimination had to do with freedom of religion, can be hard to picture, but this is how they portrayed it, because freedom of religion could be seen as something sacred. And this idea, again, that it's taking away something. So what the realtors argued and could argue in the campaign was that you didn't need to be prejudiced to support Proposition 14, far from it. You had to simply believe in American freedom and defending the rights of other people to enjoy their freedom. So on the billboards across on the Los Angeles freeways, the motto was freedom of choice, freedom to choose. This language of freedom of choice was so successful that in the 1964 ballot, the same ballot where Lyndon Johnson won 60% of the vote, 65% of the voters supported the realtors. 75% of the white voters, 82% of the white union voters, who had been the core support of the Democratic Party, in effect, splitting the FDR traditional Democratic coalition. Why did this message become so important to American politics? For three reasons. First, here we are at the very low point of conservatism in America. Goldwater has been radically defeated. Not only did he only win 40% of the vote, but exit surveys asked how many of his voters voted for him because he was a conservative. And the answer was a quarter. The rest supported him because he was a Republican Party. And so that's like 10% of the voters self-identified as conservatives in that election. So here at this very low point in conservatism, here was a message that the realtors created. If you could win 75% of the white votes in California, you could win anywhere. So the notion of homeowner rights then got adopted by Ronald Reagan in 1966. Remember, he hadn't endorsed Proposition 14. He's now running for governor. And in the middle of the campaign, the state Supreme Court rules it unconstitutional. Reagan adopts a populist language and starts using the realtors' language, almost word for word, through the campaign. And he says, if an individual wants to discriminate against a Negro or others in selling or renting his house, it is his right to do so. He uses the same language. This is, discrimination. This is like freedom of religion. He claims, he doesn't have a racist bone in his body, but this is the language of homeowner rights. He had been floundering in the campaign, trying to find a way to take the general rhetoric, the same rhetoric as Goldwater had used. This gave him a concrete way of identifying with ordinary people and of appealing to the white, union voters who've been Democrats. A second reason this was so important was conservatives at the time were split between social conservatives, often Catholic, in favor of, Sunday closing laws and school prayer, so forth, wanting government to impose traditions on people, and libertarians, individual freedom, no restriction from government. What the realtors done with this language of individual freedom is they had linked these two. They used libertarian language of absolute individual freedom to enforce traditional social conformity, what might seem its opposite. But this combination provided a way to link on issue after issue, and you hear it today, the conservative movement. It said to voters that what liberal government is doing is take issues weren't merely policy issues, they were issues of freedom, of your basic freedom that was being taken away to give to other people. And the last thing that was important was it used racially neutral rhetoric. So here we are, 1964, in the creation of a new Republican Party. The idea of today's modern Republican Party really goes back to Charles Wallace Collins, a Southern banking lawyer, art segregationist, who in 1948, after President Truman appointed a committee on civil rights for the first time, said, the handwriting is on the wall for the South. If we want to defend Jim Crow, Southern Democrats have to leave the Democratic Party and join an alliance with those Northern Republicans who will agree to protect local control of racial issues in return for the federal government not regulating business, this joint alliance. This led to the Dixiecrat Rebellion in 1948. Such a party now became possible in 1964 after Goldwater did well in some southern states and Strom Thurmond joined the Republican Party. This would be an entirely new Republican Party. Remember, in 1964 and 1965, 80% of Republicans in Congress voted for the Civil Rights Act and for the Voting Rights Act, higher percentage of Democrats. So this is a new Republican Party, and it needed a rhetoric that could be used both in the North and the South. Could work in California, could work in Pennsylvania, as well as in Alabama. And here was this racially neutral rhetoric of freedom that the realtors had invented. This then became so much the defining rhetoric of the Republican Party on issue after issue, that the natural dynamics of that party push it further and further to those who endorse it as the only meaning of American freedom. So let me, in the last couple of minutes, just talk about why this is so important in terms of segregation today. So the realtors fought hard, even if Proposition 14 was constitutional, against fair housing around the country, using the same arguments and the same methods. Federal fair housing was finally passed in 1968 over the realtors' objections. Sort of Lyndon Johnson had outfoxed them with congressional maneuvers. And then Martin Luther King was assassinated, and the days after the assassination, fair housing finally passed. But it was tremendously weakened by the shadow of Proposition 14, by politicians of both parties knowing about this populist, revolt that the realtors had led. That's weakened fair housing ever since. And so it's not been enforced in strong ways. And in fact, in terms of people losing licenses, the realtors officially, of course, have endorsed fair housing. But at the individual level, you can see stories like in Newsday, Long Island Divided, about how it persists at an individual level. But at a deeper level, the legacy that the realtors created, the homeowners associations of suburbs specially created to be racially exclusive, of single family zoning, all those powerful institutions were created. It would have taken the power of government to overcome and to break those down. And if you ask why in America today, African Americans who make, in 2012, who make $60,000 a year, live in neighborhoods where the median income is $12,000. If you ask why that exists, it's because this rhetoric of freedom has so shaped the ability to enforce fair housing and to overcome the obstacles that were put in place back in the 1960s. So why don't I stop there and take questions about any of these, diverse areas. But the point that I really want to make to sum up is that if you think that the story of modern American history is really a story of how we deal with fairly intractable divides, social, economic, geographic, political, ideological. Those divides were created as a way first to segregate houses and then to defend neighborhoods and then to defend that segregation. These stories are directly linked together. So residential segregation, far from being at the periphery of the creation of modern America, really was at its center. Thanks.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Jean. And folks, we can take Q&A. You can put it in the chat or you can use the Q&A function. Looks like we have one question in chat, and that's from Mr. William. It seems like not much has changed. What, if anything, can be done?
Well, certainly there are things that can be done at all sorts of levels. In terms of non-discrimination, that level, I think if fair housing is enforced, and this is partly a matter of state choices as well as federal, if fair housing is enforced so that brokers lose their licenses, for discriminating and for racial steering, if appraisers lose their appraisal licenses, and there are articles in the last year or so in the Washington Post and the New York Times showing the level of discrimination by appraisers depending on who's at the house when they think the client is when they're doing the appraisal. If banks who have historically in the last 10 years turned down African Americans with the same credit scores as twice the rate as whites, if there were serious consequences, that would make a difference at an individual level. At the institutional level, there's a second part of the fair housing law. One part is for non-discrimination, and the other part is called furthering fair housing. And it sets a program which says the federal government giving money to local governments around the country has to condition that money on whether it's helping break down the barriers to segregation. After Richard Nixon was elected, after he promised and got the nomination, after promising to Strom Thurmond that he wouldn't enforce fair housing, that after that happened, George Romney, the first Secretary of HUD, started with Open Communities to seriously take this affirmatively for furthering fair housing. He was dismissed as secretary and undermined. And Nixon said, quoting the Realtors rhetoric, the same language of freedom of choice, said, well, segregation is a result of millions of free choices by, both blacks and whites. So this language of choice Ronald Reagan appointed as his first Attorney General, who had been his chief lawyer, the chief lawyer for the California Real Estate Association and Proposition 14, William French Smith, did a lot to dismantle these efforts. Donald Trump, summer of 2020, actually that's only 15 months ago, had gone on a whole thing of eliminating the Obama era rules on affirmatively fair housing, saying we're going to save suburban housewives for minorities and low income. So, and the Biden administration is resurrecting that. So there are things that can be done, but I think the point that I'm trying to make from this history is what really matters is fair housing has been used as a whipping boy for this argument about individual freedom and freedom of choice. And so you had Mario Rubio in 2015, other Republican senators sponsoring the bill that Trump later cited in its regulations called the Freedom of Choice Act. And it supported freedom, it called freedom of choice being the freedom to zone, the freedom to exclude. And if there's one thing I want to leave people with in this is partly I've analyzed all the ways that these two opposite meanings of freedom. I mean, Americans across the political spectrum agree, freedom is our highest value. This is the great paradox of American politics. We all agree freedom is our highest value, but it's being used in two opposite ways. And it isn't that Ronald Reagan had a slightly different meaning of it than Jimmy Carter or Joe Biden. It's this meaning was deliberately created to undermine and to limit civil rights. That was its purpose. And liberals and progressives have largely left the rhetoric of freedom behind and let it be dominated by conservatives who in their campaigns call themselves the only freedom-loving Americans. If you want to change that, and part of my book is sort of looking at what are all the elements of that package, how it was designed and how you can oppose it. If you want to change that, you need to use two different words. You need to say, that's not freedom as we mean it. That's exclusive freedom. That's the freedom to exclude. That's freedom for some people, as opposed to inclusive freedom, freedom for everybody, freedom that's shared, freedom from the country as a whole. That was a long answer, but I think it means changing the language and the understanding of our politics if fair housing is going to be enforced and segregation is going to be dismantled. Other questions? Fair game here. I could go on forever, so please try me.
What should today's San Francisco Realtors Association or other realtors associations do, if anything, to make amends for this legacy of discrimination?
That's a very good question. On the letterhead of the California Association of Realtors, it says, acknowledging the past in order to build a more equitable future. And in all their rhetoric and in all their official statements, and they're supportive of fair housing. As I said, at an individual level, in terms of more money for training, more money for enforcement, could go a long way. But I've sort of wrestled with that issue. What can be done? So in some ways, my book is the story of the real estate industry's role. There are issues, Richard Rothstein's book, Color of Law, it's really a case about government and what government has done. But as I try and show through FHA, it was the realtors who shaped the government. They called FHA their agency in the federal government. So if you ask what realtors can do, here's a somewhat crazy idea because it doesn't involve the political issues of reparations, which probably can be handled better by providing like additional down payment assistance for people who've lived in areas that were redlined. I think it's probably the easiest way to deal with the legal issues of that. And there are efforts in the Build America Better program and bill in Congress, if it survives, that address some of those issues. In terms of the real estate industry itself, when you talk about reparations, people's reactions, well, that was done by other people, 50 years ago, or whatever, it wasn't me, I don't benefit, I didn't do that, I didn't make those choices. The real estate industry and the realtors are kind of unique because the real estate commissions that got increased from 2.5% to 5% and 6% or so, was done by the same real estate boards, Los Angeles Real Estate Board, the largest, most powerful in the country, in the same era, and as part of the same approach by the same people who created segregation. This is something all realtors, members of real estate boards, still benefit from. So if realtors wanted to do something about that, you could say the average home price in the country that realtors sell is like $350,000. You could take, for the next 5 years, 0.1% of the commission that they're making, the extra commission that they're making, because they double commissions, on the amount above that sale price, and put it in a fund the realtors would provide that could be used by state and local agencies for down payment assistance for those who've been discriminated. That's something the realtors could do. That was a good question. Next.
I have a question from our YouTube viewer. What do you think would be one good way, it's kind of the same questions, one big good way to give them reparations?
I think that's really the same
Yeah.
question. I think there's the question of federal policy in which you really ought to think, I mean, rather than calling it reparations, which sounds like something new for something that, went away in the past, I think from a federal program point of view, it's important to recognize that the programs that were created, FHA and VA, that so discriminated. I mean, only 2% of African Americans could get loans. And why was that? Because they had rules. They had redlining maps. We won't lend in an area where minorities live, and will require racial covenants on the new suburbs where we will make loans. So I think I think one should view these federal programs or down payment assistance provided with them as a continuation. It's the same federal homeownership program, just continued, and simply now addressing the unmet needs that were denied before. So I think that's one way to think about that issue. Now, there is one, before the next question, there is one thing which I didn't talk about, which may be interesting and important to people, which is I said these racial covenants originally were against all non-Caucasians. What did non-Caucasians mean? It didn't simply mean African Americans or Japanese or Chinese. It meant in the 19-teens, 1920s, the 1930s, 40s, it often meant Jews, it meant Italians, it meant Greeks, it meant the whole wave of European immigrants who then gradually, especially during World War II, became viewed as white and acceptable. Who was Caucasian? Who was allowed in was decided by the local real estate board. It was the local real estate board that controlled, like in the Oakland Tribune, which ads could be placed from which streets and be called restricted or non-restricted. There's nothing about individual choice. If there's anything that becomes clear from my story, it's that segregation was not a matter of individual choice. Segregation was the creation of an organized system and all its tools. Sorry, that was a detour. Next question.
I don't see any more questions, but let's give the folks a little time to, they get shy sometimes.
I want to talk for a minute about the theme I said early on, which is that segregation has reshaped the country for everybody. Obviously, there are the people, the groups who it's tremendously damaged and limited their lives, limited educational opportunities, economic opportunities, the opportunities to build household wealth. I mean, at the time when African Americans were prevented from buying homes and FHA and VA programs, the real cost of a house was like 1/5 of what it is today. Bay Area, 1/7 of what it is today. So the result of denying household wealth comes directly out of that. And there was an amazing study by the federal, I'll just keep chatting until you prompt me with another question. There was an amazing study by the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago in 2017. They went back to these redlining boundaries, on maps, red meant an area they wouldn't make any loans and so forth. And they looked at every one of those boundaries in every 350 metropolitan areas in the country. Every one of the boundaries that was just along the street. It wasn't a river or a railroad track, because they were somewhat arbitrary at the time, right? You decided this area would be yellow or green, and this would be allowed, and they make loans. They went back and they found that at the time in the 1930s, there was hardly any difference on 3 blocks on either side or 6 blocks on either side of these boundaries, because they were arbitrary. Very little difference in home ownership condition or price of houses or occupancy or overcrowding, so forth. They went back in 2017 and looked at exactly these same boundaries. And what did they find? There were enormous differences. The differences between these two sides had like quadrupled. This is an analog for what's happened over all these years, that the effects of segregation then compounded over time. And what we're dealing with, just like you have compound interest, on loans or in savings accounts, this is the compounding effect of all of those decisions.
Yeah,
Another question?
I would imagine the health disparities and all of that is part of this, all wrapped up.
Right. There was one study from Duke University in Chicago that showed that even just in the 1950s, I think it was 1950s and early 1960s, the wealth deprivation from not being able to buy homes and get mortgages for African Americans in Chicago was $3 billion. Just to give you, that's one city, one decade. Give you a flavor of how much impact this had on people's lives and people's lives today.
Let's take one last question here, and that's maybe you know this. Do you know when St. Francis Wood in San Francisco eliminated its racial covenants?
Well, at one level, St. Francis Wood started in 1912. It was sort of McDuffie's second great project, and the one that won all sorts of national awards. It's like the best subdivision in America. By the way, the mayor of Berkeley in 1935, around the same time, the University of California at Berkeley gave Duncan McDuffie a degree, an honorary degree for his contribution to residential development. The mayor of Berkeley said that the neighborhoods he's created are a testament to the progressive character of America's people. That'll give you a flavor of the public support for this. So racial covenants, the Supreme Court in 1948 said courts can't enforce them. So they basically existed. There were then efforts in the legislation in California to remove them. So to the extent they actually still exist or are still recorded in deeds, they've probably expired by now, but they can't be enforced by courts. That key decision was the US Supreme Court in 1948. And that's what prompted the Realtors to try and overturn the US constitutional, 14th Amendment.
One more question came.
Okay, sure.
What penalties might the realtors be liable for, or can government effect some justice on them?
Well, I think the issues are about what happens today. I don't think there are penalties. I mean, I've suggested, within the realtors themselves could voluntarily do something. And first of all, it was the government who the realtors were in league with and supported and helped shape, who did all these things that supported that. So the question is, what can be done about actions by real estate brokers? Not only realtors are members of real estate boards, there are other real estate brokers as well. But what can be done in the area of racial steering? And as I say, if you look to Long Island Divided, a story on Newsday that uses Long Island as microcosm, but it's an excellent study in 2019. Which hired racial testers, Black and white couples, and saw the differences in treatment, what homes they were shown, what neighborhoods, the assumptions that were made. If people lost their licenses because of that, that would, I think, have a big difference at that individual level. That's not the total issue. I mean, people buy homes by looking on Zillow and checking school scores. There's lots of other stuff that goes on. But at the level of what can be done to deal with discrimination now, that can help.
Thank you, Jean. And then there's just some appreciation and thank you for your deep, thoughtful presentation, making this situation so clear. And yeah, thank you for your insight on this history.
Thank you very much. And
Yeah,
the
and
book-
let me
yeah.
throw in the chat one more time the link for tonight's event, which has links
Here's
to
the book, Freedom to Discriminate. It's
the
really
books.
the
Yeah.
history. It's really the history. In many ways, it's the history of how this happened, and it connects segregation to its impact on American politics and how it shaped that rhetoric of the idea of freedom. So it links these two, as I said, defining features of America together, and sees that segregation shaped the lives of all Americans, and it does so today in every issue that we're dealing with.
And you can get Jean's book at your favorite library or your favorite local bookstore, or you can purchase straight from Heyday's website as well. All right, friends, and thank you to Heyday. Thank you, Jean Slater, for being here tonight and providing us such an amazing conversation. And library community, as always, thank you for joining us as well.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sleep well.
Okay.
We'll see you here tomorrow. Come on back.